Well, I mean, COVID was an impact to everybody's life, but the dream that I had is I knew about something that had happened a long time ago in New Orleans and how it was related to a polio vaccine. And I thought to myself, probably, I'm going to say 3.5, 4 years ago,
Mhm.
when all the stuff started with Eco Health Alliance and Fauci and the stuff that was going on with China and Ukraine having level 4 bioweapons labs over there. I just thought to myself, reading some of the papers, wouldn't it be ironic if some of the stuff that happened in the 50s and 60s spilled out, into the modern way of doing technologies? And I was aware of Dr. Malone's work around RNA technology, and I just started to read some patents about the mRNA technology. And one of the things that I noticed was things hadn't changed too much since I was in med school and residency. You still needed some way to get past the nuclear membrane in order to make messenger RNA technology operate. And right now, the only way to do that, or I should say, even back then, 20, 25 years ago, is using DNA plasmids or something called the SV40 promoter.
Mm.
And the SV40 promoter we learned about because of the story in the polio vaccine that I told you I learned about a long time ago. And when it became obvious to me in about January, February of 2020 that the WHO was gonna, make a call on a pandemic and it was tied to this coronavirus,
Mhm.
and let's put it this way, I had a very open mind, but when I started to hear this stuff about the vaccine very, very early on, I was like, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense. They
Mhm.
had to be working on this even before this started. And so I started doing some digging, and that digging led, you know, to some of the science. And I realized almost immediately that I had to connect the dots between what happened in the Cutter event, what was going on in the pandemic. And I really believe that the pandemic was a planned event, by the World Economic Forum, but it had a lot of different players. This was not just one institution that could pull something like this off. And I also knew that the Department of Defense had to be involved because I knew what the chain of events was with SV40, where it came from, that the Department of Defense was involved heavily in it when it eventually went from the Delta Primate Center in New Orleans to Fort Detrick, which was our bioweapons lab before the Patriot Act was done. And it became very clear to me very early in 2020 that the transfer of molecular genetic information went from the United States to outside of our borders. And that's when I started really paying attention to a lot of the details. And in the details, the things that concerned me the most that I explained to my members at the
Mhm.
time is that there was two legal definitions that were on the books for the vaccines. And I thought that this was highly unusual. And the night that I had this dream, I thought about why they would do that. And it dawned on me that they would use one for the FDA trial and they would use the second one for the vaccine that they would use on people. So that way they could get through some of the geoengineering information and skate past most of the centralized thinkers about this. Now, some of the molecular geneticists that were involved in this were smart enough to pick up on this. Like, for example, Robert Malone and Dr. McCullough, who's a cardiologist, they were on this pretty early, like I was. In fact, we all did a documentary called COVID Revealed that had to be behind a paywall
Mhm.
at that time. And this specific topic was the number one thing that I brought to that table. I said, look, the fact that there's two legal definitions when these vaccines become available, I think you'd be an idiot if you take it. Why? because I think some of the things that happen in Qatar 1 event could happen in Qatar 2.0. Because if you know the way the vaccine was delivered to market, there was no safety or efficacy trials at all. I
Mhm.
said, you're basically just taking someone's word for it. And, you know, that has a name in my brand of science. It's called centralized science or centralized bullshit.
Mhm.
And I warned my own tribe. I didn't really bring this out live on the internet. I just gave a lot of casual warnings that you probably want to use solar redox and not manufactured pharmaceutical devices in order to, you know, navigate this problem. And, you know, the real problem at the time, there wasn't too many physicians. And when I say physicians, I'm talking about MDs who were clinicians that understood this, or MDs who were PhDs that worked in genetics who truly understood it. In fact, most of the MDs that were involved in this were MDs that were on TV that were hired guns
Of course.
by media, and I knew that the media was controlled by the NRO, the CIA, and the FBI. We knew that all the way back to the Church Commission in 1977. And some of the people that were even named in the Church Commission were still on network news at the time. So I knew that they would basically parrot whatever the FDA, the CDC, the DOD, um, and the AMA wanted them to. In other words, this was a very coordinated attempt. It was almost like a military. I don't want to call it a psyop because it really wasn't a psyop. It was actually a military operation. And a lot of people, I don't think, 2 or 3 years ago realized that Operation Warp Speed, if you really want to strip it down, what should you know about that if you're a voter in the United States? That this was a distribution plan of the Department of Defense. This is a DARPA sponsored event. So when people think that there's some kind of vaccine liability protection to Pfizer,